The two deeds hit the counter at the same time, and the sound they made was not the soft whisper of paper but something harder, more final, like the closing of a coffin lid. Esther Brooks did not slam them down. She placed them with the deliberate precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the dark hours before dawn, who had held these documents against her chest on the long ride from Caldwell, who had told herself she would not cry, would not tremble, would not give the man behind the counter any reason to dismiss her as merely another grieving widow with confused papers and a confused heart. She was not confused. That was the thing she needed him to understand before any word passed between them. "I have one question," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Phineas Shepard looked up from the ledger he had been bent over for the better part of an hour, and the first thing he saw was her eyes. Not the deeds, not the traveling clothes that were 3 days dusty from the road. Not the careful set of her jaw, or the way her gloved hands pressed flat against the counter, as though she needed the wood beneath them to hold her upright. He saw her eyes first, and they were the color of creek water in October, gray-green and moving with something deep underneath the surface that he recognized with a start he could not explain, because he had never met this woman before in his life. "One question," he repeated, and the words came out slower than he intended. "My husband left me 2 deeds to the same 40 acres, Esther said. "One is in my name. One is in the name of a man called Harlan Cutter. My husband has been dead for 6 weeks. Harlan Cutter is standing at the edge of my property right now with 3 hired men, and a bill of sale he claims supersedes both deeds. He told me to be off the land by Friday." She paused. "Today is Wednesday. I want to know which document is lawful, and I want to know it before I go back out that door." Phineas looked at the 2 deeds. He looked at the woman. He felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked in place for a long time, like a rusted hinge finally giving way under the right kind of pressure. "Sit down, Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly. "I would rather stand." "That is your right." He reached for the first deed. "Then let me tell you a story about how this land office works. And then let me tell you what those papers say. And then," he added, and he was not entirely certain why he kept speaking, "we are going to figure out together what comes next." She studied him for a moment with those October eyes, and whatever she was searching for, she must have found some fragment of it, because she pulled out the chair on her side of the counter and sat. That was how it began. 6 weeks earlier, Esther Brooks had been a married woman standing in a wheat field outside Caldwell, Kansas, watching the September light turn everything golden and temporary, the way light does when summer is letting go of its grip on the world. She had been married to Thomas Brooks for 4 years. She had loved him in the beginning the way a young woman loves a man who promises her a future, which is to say completely, and with very little information. Thomas was not a cruel man. He was not even, strictly speaking, a dishonest one. He was the kind of man who believed that keeping certain things private was not the same as lying, and he had built his whole life on that particular distinction until the distinction itself collapsed. The wheat had been good that year. Esther had walked the rows every morning while Thomas slept, because she was the one who understood the soil, who had grown up on her father's farm in Ohio before cholera took her parents and her brother in a single terrible summer, and left her 17 and alone in a world that had very firm opinions about what alone meant for a girl of 17. She had come west because staying east was impossible and going west was at least a direction. She had met Thomas in Wichita, and he had owned land, and she had thought that owning land meant owning a future, and she had been right about that, just not in the way she imagined. Thomas died on a Tuesday. It was his heart, the doctor said, which struck Esther as both medically accurate and philosophically strange, because Thomas's heart had always been the least reliable part of him. He had been 41. She was 28. There were no children, which was a grief she kept separate from all her other griefs, folded away in a smaller and more private place. The neighbors came with food and sympathies. The lawyer came with papers. And then, 3 days after the burial, Harlan Cutter came with a smile. Harlan Cutter was the kind of man who had learned somewhere along the way that if you smiled wide enough and talked fast enough, people would focus on your mouth and miss what your hands were doing. He was 45, broad-shouldered, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully refused anything in his life. He owned the two largest ranches in Sumner County, a feed store in Caldwell, and according to rumor, a significant portion of the county judge. He stood on Esther's porch and told her that her husband had been in debt to him, that this debt was documented, that the documentation included a deed transfer that Thomas had signed the previous spring, that the 40 acres she was standing on belonged to Harlan Cutter and had belonged to him for 6 months, and Thomas had simply neglected to inform her. Esther had looked at him for a long time. Then she had gone inside, found the deed box that Thomas kept under the floorboards beneath the kitchen table, and discovered that Thomas had, in fact, told her the truth about one thing. There was a deed with her name on it. What Thomas had neglected to mention was that there was also a deed with Harlan Cutter's name on it, and that both documents were signed, both notarized, and both referenced the exact same 40 acres. She had not slept that night. She had read both documents 6 times by candlelight until the words blurred and reassembled themselves into something she could not parse with any legal certainty. She knew wheat. She knew soil. She knew the particular heartbreak of watching something you tended with your own hands turn out to belong to someone else. But she did not know land law, and land law, as it turned out, was a very specific kind of wilderness. The next morning she had hitched the horse to the wagon, wrapped both deeds in oilcloth, tucked them inside her coat against her chest, and pointed herself toward the county seat. The Sumner County Land Office in Wellington, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, was a small building with large pretensions. It had been constructed with the intention of looking permanent and official, with a front of whitewashed board that stayed clean approximately as long as it took for the prairie wind to remember it existed. Inside there were 2 rooms, the front room where the public business was conducted across a worn oak counter, and the back room where the records were kept in filing cabinets that Phineas Shepard had organized so precisely that he could locate any document in the office inside of 3 minutes, which was a source of private satisfaction to him and mild bewilderment to everyone else. Phineas Shepard was 32 years old and had been the Sumner County Land Registrar for 3 years, which made him one of the younger land registrars in the state, and according to the opinion of the county commissioners who had appointed him, one of the more competent ones. He had grown up in Lawrence, the son of a schoolteacher and a man who had made his living as a surveyor, which meant that Phineas had grown up understanding that land was not simply dirt and grass, but rather a set of mathematical and legal relationships that could be described precisely on paper, and that the precision of that description was the difference between order and chaos. He had come to Wellington because the previous registrar had died of a fever, and the position had been advertised in the Lawrence paper. He had come alone, which was not the plan he had started with. He had started with a plan that included a woman named Clara Marsh, who had been his intended for 2 years and who had told him, 6 months before the wedding, that she had realized she did not love him the way a woman ought to love the man she was going to marry. She had said it gently, and she had meant it kindly, and it had hurt him in a way that left no visible mark, but altered something in the architecture of how he moved through the world. He had come to Wellington and thrown himself into the work of the land office with the complete dedication of a man who has decided that precision and order are adequate substitutes for the things he is not thinking about. The office became the most organized land record in the state. He knew every parcel, every filing, every transfer that had passed through those records in 3 years. He knew the legal code so thoroughly that the county judge occasionally sent clerks over with questions. He knew his work. What he had forgotten, or perhaps had been avoiding knowing, was what it felt like to be surprised. When Esther Brooks walked through his door on that Wednesday morning in October with 2 deeds, and a steadiness that he recognized as the particular courage of someone who is barely holding together and refusing to let anyone see the seams, Phineas Shepard was surprised. Not just by the legal situation, which was genuinely unusual, by the specific quality of her presence in his small, organized office. He made himself focus on the documents. The first deed was registered. He found it in his files in under 2 minutes, the way he always found everything, and the finding of it told him something important. The deed in Esther's name was filed on April 14, 1879. The deed in Harlan Cutter's name was not in his files at all, which was either an administrative error or something considerably more troubling. Where was the Cutter deed notarized? He asked, without looking up from the file. The notary stamp says Wichita, Esther said. Phineas looked up. Wichita is Sedgwick County. This land is in Sumner County. A deed transfer for land in Sumner County that was notarized in Wichita and never filed in Wellington is not a valid transfer. It is a piece of paper with a stamp on it. The silence that followed had a particular quality, like the air after a church bell stops ringing. "Say that again," Esther said softly. "The deed in your name was filed properly with this office 6 months ago. It is the legal title to the property." The document in Harlan Cutter's name was never filed here, which means under Kansas land law, it has no standing. It does not matter when it was signed or by whom. Esther closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were very bright, and he watched her breathe once carefully, the way someone breathes when they are deciding not to fall apart. "He told me he had a bill of sale," she said. "A bill of sale for real property without a properly filed deed transfer is worth approximately as much as a bill of sale for the moon. Harlan Cutter does not own your land, Mrs. Brooks, at least not on any basis I can find in these records." He paused. "However," she watched him. "However," he continued carefully, "the fact that your husband signed a deed transfer in Wichita tells me there was likely a debt involved. The transaction itself may have been genuine. It is the execution that was improper, which means Cutter may have legal grounds for a debt claim against the estate, which is a separate matter from land ownership. It also means he is going to try to claim that the improper filing was a clerical error and that his rights supersede yours. He will need a lawyer and a judge for that argument, but if he owns a significant portion of the county judge, as some people seem to believe, he may feel confident about his chances." Esther was quiet for a moment. "You know who Harlan Cutter is?" "I know of him. I have no personal dealings with the man. But you know he is not someone who accepts being told no." Phineas looked at her steadily. "I know that the law is the law regardless of who does or does not accept it. What I do not know is whether the enforcement of that law will be as simple as presenting these documents." He folded his hands on the counter. "Mrs. Brooks, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Not on the property?" The question surprised her. He could see it in the slight change of her expression. "I have the property," she said. "You have the legal title to the property. That is not the same as the property being safe for you to occupy alone, while a man with 3 hired men and uncertain ethics believes it is his." He said it without softness because he thought she was the kind of woman who preferred the plain shape of a thing to a decorated version. "I am asking where you can stay while we pursue the proper legal resolution." The "we" in that sentence surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. He had not planned to say "we." He had not planned anything about this conversation except to examine the documents and render an accurate legal opinion, which is what he had done in every similar situation for 3 years. But none of those previous situations had involved October eyes, and a courage so visible it was almost painful to look at directly. "There is a boarding house," Esther said after a moment, "on the main street. Mrs. Hensley's. It is reputable. You seem very familiar with Wellington." "I have lived here for 3 years." "You do not seem like a man who has lived here for 3 years," she said, and it was an odd thing to say, and she seemed to know it because she looked momentarily uncertain. I mean that you seem like you are still deciding whether to stay. It was so precisely accurate that he had no answer for it. He walked her to Mrs. Hensley's boarding house himself, carrying the small bag she had brought from the wagon. He told himself this was simple courtesy, the natural extension of a professional consultation. The November wind had come early to Wellington, and the street was doing what Kansas streets did in autumn, which was to remind everyone on them that the prairie had opinions about the relative insignificance of human plans. Esther walked beside him with the kind of stride that said she had covered ground on foot many times and expected to cover more. "How long were you married?" he asked, and immediately felt the question was too personal. "4 years," she said, without hesitation. Thomas was not a bad man. He was a man who believed that solving problems by pretending they did not exist was a legitimate approach to life. It stopped working for him eventually. "I am sorry." "Thank you." "I'm also sorry, though what I am sorry about is more complicated than his death." She glanced at him sideways. "I am sorry for the wheat. It was going to be a good harvest. I planted it in August. I will need to sell it before it turns, and with everything that is happening, I do not know if I can manage the harvest and the legal situation simultaneously." "The legal situation should resolve quickly," he said. "If Cutter tries to pursue it through the courts, I can testify to what the records show. The filing is clear. The registrar's record is the primary legal document in a land dispute. And if Cutter decides not to use the courts—" He did not answer that immediately because it was the question that concerned him most and he wanted to answer it honestly. "Then we will need to be faster than he is." They reached Mrs. Hensley's. He handed her the bag at the door, and she took it and then stood there for a moment as though she had more to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Mr. Shepard," she said finally, "why are you helping me beyond the requirements of your position?" He thought about that. He had been thinking about it since approximately the moment she had sat down across the counter from him, which was also approximately the moment he had understood that whatever answer he gave her would need to be truthful, because she was the kind of woman to whom lying, even the ordinary social variety, would feel like an insult. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because I find I am interested in what happens to your wheat." It was not the complete truth, but it was a piece of it, and she seemed to know there were other pieces, and she nodded once as though she would accept the partial version for now. "I will be at your office first thing in the morning," she said. "I will be there." She went inside. He stood on the street for a moment in the cold wind before turning back toward the office, where he had 3 hours of work remaining and a growing awareness that his carefully ordered life had just become, in some fundamental way, less orderly. Harlan Cutter arrived at the land office the following morning at 9 o'clock, 40 minutes before Esther, and carrying an attorney. The attorney was a man named Tobias Vane, whom Phineas knew by reputation as someone who had been disbarred in Missouri for reasons that had never been made entirely public, and who had reinvented himself in Kansas with a new state license and a careful silence about his history. He was thin and tall and spoke with the kind of elaborate precision that is meant to sound like legal expertise and sometimes is not. Harlan Cutter himself was exactly as described: broad, smiling, with the particular warmth of a man who has decided that charm is simply another tool. He introduced himself unnecessarily, since everyone in Sumner County knew who he was, and laid his copy of the Cutter deed on the counter as though placing a trump card. "I understand there may be some confusion about the Brooks property," he said pleasantly. "There is no confusion," Phineas said. "The deed in Esther Brooks's name was filed with this office on April 14th. The document you are presenting was notarized in Wichita and has never been filed with this office, which means it does not constitute a valid transfer of real property in Sumner County." Harlan's smile did not change, but something behind it did, some slight recalibration. "That sounds like a clerical oversight. These things happen. The obligation to file rests with the purchaser, not the clerk. An unfiled deed is not a clerical oversight. It is an incomplete transaction." Tobias Vane leaned forward. "The precedent you are citing, registrar, is not as settled as you suggest. There are cases in Kansas in which a properly executed deed takes priority over a filing date, particularly where fraud in the original filing is alleged." Phineas looked at him. "Are you alleging fraud in the original filing?" "We are suggesting it as a possibility." "Then that allegation would need to be pursued in district court, where I would be happy to present the complete record of this office and testify to the validity of the filing process. Until a court order instructs me otherwise, the filed deed in Mrs. Brooks's name represents the lawful title to this property." Harlan Cutter was still smiling, but the quality of it had changed completely. "You seem very invested in this matter for a land registrar, Mr. Shepard." "I am invested in the accuracy of my records. That is my job." "Of course it is." He picked up the deed. "We will be in touch." They left. Phineas stood at the counter for a moment and then went to the window and watched them walk down the street, two men moving with the unhurried confidence of people who believe time is on their side. Then he went to his back room and spent 45 minutes reading every piece of Kansas land law he could put his hands on, specifically the sections pertaining to priority of filing, the definition of a valid transfer, and the rights of a surviving spouse. Esther arrived at 9:40 with a shawl against the cold and 2 cups of coffee from the dining room at Mrs. Hensley's, which she had wrapped in cloth to keep them warm on the walk over. She set one on the counter without asking whether he wanted it, as though it were simply obvious that a man who had clearly already been working for 2 hours might want coffee. He told her about Cutter's visit. He told her about Tobias Vane. He told her what the law said and what the vulnerabilities were. He watched her face move through the information with the particular focus of someone who is not panicking, but is calculating, running the numbers behind her eyes. "If they take it to court," she said, "how long does that take?" "Weeks, possibly months, depending on the judge's docket." "I cannot wait months. The wheat will turn in 3 to 4 weeks. If I cannot harvest and sell it, I lose the primary income from the property for the year." "I know." "And if Cutter's men damage the crop in the meantime?" "I know," he said again, and he meant it differently the second time, not as a repetition, but as a promise that he had already thought about this and was thinking about it still. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The morning light came through the small office windows and lay across the worn oak counter in long rectangles, and outside the street was beginning to wake up into the particular busy noise of a county seat in autumn, when everyone who has spent summer isolated on their land comes into town to transact all the business that summer's work has postponed. "Tell me something," Esther said suddenly. "Are you afraid of Harlan Cutter?" He considered the question seriously, which seemed to be what she wanted. "I am respectful of what a man like that is capable of when he feels that normal channels have been closed to him. That is not the same as afraid." "Good," she said. "Because I am not afraid of him either. I was, when he first came to the house. But I have been thinking about it for 3 days, and I have decided that being afraid of him is not useful information. What is useful is that I know my rights, and I know what the law says, and I have found someone who knows it too." She looked at him. "You are the first person who has told me plainly what the situation is. Everyone else I spoke to in Caldwell told me to speak to a lawyer, or told me it was complicated, or suggested I might want to consider selling and moving somewhere less troublesome. You told me what was true. It is my job to tell you what the records say." "Yes," she said. "But you could have told me in a way that left me confused. You chose not to." She said it simply, without flattery, just the observation of a fact, and it struck him somewhere in the vicinity of his chest with more force than he was prepared for. He had spent 3 years being precise and thorough and correct in his work, and in 3 years not a single person had noticed that the precision was a choice, that the clarity was a decision made on behalf of the person across the counter. She had noticed in 24 hours. He cleared his throat. "I am going to write a formal legal opinion today documenting the status of both deeds and the basis for the priority of the filed title." I am going to have it witnessed by 2 county officials and filed with the district court as a preemptive record. If Cutter initiates a court challenge, the judge will have this documentation from the outset." "That is very thorough," she said. "Thorough is the only way I know to work." "Then I am glad you are on my side of this," she said, and the simplicity of the word side, the way she placed it without self-consciousness, made him feel something he had not felt in a long time, which was the specific warmth of being included. The next 10 days were a particular kind of education for both of them. Phineas finished his legal opinion and had it filed. He sent a copy to the county attorney, a man named George Alderman, who was honest enough and competent enough, but who also knew which way the wind blew politically in Sumner County, which meant he was helpful but cautious. Alderman confirmed that the standing of the filed deed was solid and that any challenge would face significant legal obstacles. What Alderman could not do was prevent Harlan Cutter's hired men from riding the fence line of Esther's property every morning at dawn, which they did with a methodical patience that was clearly meant to communicate something beyond simple surveillance. They did not cross onto the property. They did not damage anything, at least not in any way that could be proven. They simply rode the line, 3 men on horses, every morning before the sun was fully up, as though they were keeping something penned in rather than keeping it out. Esther returned to the property on the 3rd day because she had decided, and she told Phineas this with a finality that left no room for argument, that she was not going to allow Harlan Cutter to use her absence from her own land as any kind of leverage. She had a horse and a shotgun, and she knew how to use both. The neighbor to the east, a farmer named Marcus Webb who was not afraid of Cutter and had said so publicly on several occasions, agreed to keep watch. Phineas found himself riding out to the Brooks property on the following Saturday afternoon under the pretense of delivering a copy of the filed legal opinion, which he could have sent with the post or asked Marcus Webb to carry. He told himself this was due diligence, the land registrar confirming the accuracy of the property's physical boundaries. He told himself this for approximately 6 miles of Kansas prairie before he stopped telling himself anything and simply rode. Esther was in the wheat field when he arrived. She was moving through the rows with a tool he recognized as a soil probe, checking the grain heads, her hair coming loose from its pins, because the wind did not respect practical arrangements. She saw him come through the gate and raised one hand in greeting, finished what she was doing with the probe, and walked to meet him at the fence. She was not what any of his organized internal categories had a ready place for. She was not beautiful in the way that announced itself immediately and demanded acknowledgement. She was beautiful in the way that a landscape is, which is to say it required time and attention to perceive it fully, and the more you looked the more there was. She had strong hands and a direct gaze, and she moved as though she had an opinion about the ground beneath her feet. "The grain is 10 days from ready," she said by way of greeting. "That is good. It is very good if nothing goes wrong." She looked at the fence line where the afternoon was quiet and undisturbed. "They rode again this morning." "I know. Marcus Webb sent word to the county sheriff. And the sheriff sent word back that riding a public road adjacent to private property is not a crime." She nodded, unsurprised. "Is the sheriff in Cutter's pocket too?" "I do not know that he is in anyone's pocket. I think he is a man who prefers to avoid confrontation with powerful people when there is no clear legal mandate to provide him with cover." Phineas tied his horse to the post. "Which is why the legal opinion matters. It gives anyone who wants to enforce your rights a clear legal basis on which to stand." They walked along the edge of the field. The wheat moved in the wind with a collective sound that was almost musical, thousands of individual stalks making the same motion, and Phineas found himself thinking that this was what she was protecting, not just the land but the thing the land did when she tended it, this particular aliveness. "Tell me about yourself," Esther said suddenly. "I beg your pardon. You know a great deal about my situation. I know you are the land registrar and you have been here 3 years and you know the law extremely well. I do not know who you are." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved the wheat. "I grew up in Lawrence. My mother taught school. My father surveyed land, which is where I got the interest in it. I came here because the position was open and I needed—" He paused. "A direction," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Yes. That is a good word for it. I know what that feels like." She did not ask what he had been moving away from, which was also the kind of courtesy that he noticed and filed away. "Do you like Wellington?" "I like the work. The town is adequate. I have not," he said carefully, "made the kind of connections here that make a place feel like home." "No," she said, "I can see that." She said it gently, without pity. "I think you are a man who is very good at being useful and very cautious about being known." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. "That is a very direct observation," he said. "I am a direct person. I find that being otherwise wastes time." She studied his face. "Have I offended you?" "No," he said, and meant it completely. "You have surprised me." She smiled then, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face in the way that firelight changes a room, not illuminating it so much as making it suddenly different, warmer, full of movement. "Good," she said. "You strike me as a man who does not get surprised very often, and I think that is probably not ideal for a person." He laughed, which also surprised him, because it came without warning, a real laugh rather than the polite social variety, and she looked pleased with it in a way that was completely without artifice. They walked until the sun was getting low, and then she made coffee over the kitchen fire, and they sat at the table in her small house and talked for 2 more hours. Not about the legal situation, not about Harlan Cutter, not about anything that had to do with the problem that had brought them together. They talked about Lawrence and Ohio, about the difference between the soil in the East and the soil on the prairie, about books, about the particular loneliness of making a life in a new place, about the strange way grief and hope can live in the same body at the same time without either canceling the other out. When he finally stood to leave, the night was full and cold, and the stars over the Kansas prairie were the extravagant winter kind that make you feel both very small and very awake. "Will you come back?" she asked at the door. The question was simple and direct, and he understood that it contained several possible meanings, some professional and some not, and that she knew he understood this, and that she was asking anyway. "Yes," he said, "I will come back." He rode back to Wellington in the dark and did not sleep much. And when he sat down at his desk the next morning, he was aware that something in his relationship to his organized, precise, quiet life had shifted. The way a river shifts when a new tributary joins it. Not the same course, not wrong, just different and moving faster. The legal challenge came from Tobias Vane on a Tuesday, which was also the day Phineas received the first threat. The challenge was filed with the district court in Wellington, citing the argument that Esther's deed had been improperly obtained through Thomas Brooks's misrepresentation of the property's encumbered status at the time of its filing. It was a creative argument. Phineas had to grant that. It was also, in his legal opinion, a paper-thin one, but paper-thin arguments had a way of gaining substance when the right judge was holding them. The threat was less formal. It arrived as a message delivered by a boy of about 12 who knocked on the land office door late in the afternoon and handed Phineas a folded piece of paper with the air of someone who had been paid to deliver it and was not interested in the contents. The note said, in a handwriting that was too careful to be natural, "Some records can develop errors. It would be a shame if an otherwise distinguished career were affected by clerical problems that no one could explain." Phineas read it twice. Then he walked to the small iron stove in the corner of the back room and burned it, because he was not going to keep a threat as documentation. He had a better plan. He went to see George Alderman that afternoon and told him about the court filing and the note's general content without producing the note itself. Alderman listened carefully and told him, with the careful phrasing of a man navigating a political minefield, that the district court judge assigned to the case was newly appointed and had no known connections to Cutter, which was either excellent news or the result of Cutter's usual connections being replaced by something more subtle. The following morning, Phineas rode out to Esther's property and told her all of it. They sat at her kitchen table again, the same table where they had talked for 2 hours about Lawrence and Ohio, and the ease of that evening was still present between them, but covered now by the weight of the situation, and he watched her work through the implications with the same systematic focus she had applied to the soil probe in her wheat field, methodically, without panic. "They want to frighten you away from supporting me," she said. "They want to compromise the records. My testimony as registrar is the foundation of your legal position. If my credibility is questioned, or if the records themselves appeared altered, then their argument about your filing irregularity gains credibility from the fact of an actual irregularity." She shook her head. "That is not just threatening you. That is threatening to manufacture the evidence of the claim they have not been able to substantiate." "Yes," he said. "Phineas." She had started using his given name 2 visits ago, and the first time she did it he had had to pause his sentence because the sound of it in her voice was distracting in a way he had not anticipated. "I do not want you to risk your position because of my situation. I am not at risk as long as my records are intact and properly secured, which they are." He met her eyes. "And your situation has become something I have a personal interest in resolving correctly." The word personal sat between them for a moment, neither of them moving it. "I have a personal interest too," she said carefully, "in the resolution, and in other things." He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at her hands on the table, closer than they needed to be if the table had been a purely functional object between them. He thought about Clara Marsh and the way she had told him gently that something was missing, and he thought about the fact that whatever had been missing then was not missing now, or at least not in the same way, because with Esther Brooks he felt entirely present, which was something he had not been in a very long time. "Esther," he said, and stopped. She waited. "When this is resolved," he said, "I would like to call on you properly, if that is something you would consider." She looked at him with those October eyes that were doing something complicated right now, something that involved the particular mix of hope and caution that belongs to people who have already been hurt and know exactly how much it costs. Then she said, quietly, "I think I would consider it very seriously." The wheat came in on a Wednesday. Marcus Webb organized the harvest, bringing 4 men from neighboring farms with the understanding that the community solidarity involved was also a political statement, because everyone in Sumner County knew about the dispute and everyone had opinions about Harlan Cutter, and this was the prairie, where community solidarity was sometimes the only law that moved fast enough to matter. Phineas took a day away from the office, something he had not done in 3 years, and came to help with the harvest. He was not particularly experienced with wheat harvest, which he admitted readily, and Esther put him to work tying the bound sheaves because it required more precision than muscle, and he was good at it, and she watched him work with an expression she did not entirely conceal. The day was warm for October, the sky that particular deep blue that the prairie produces in autumn as though compensating for the winter to come. There was bread and cold chicken at midday and coffee all day long, and by late afternoon the field was done, the grain bound and stacked, and the air smelling of cut wheat and dust, and the particular satisfaction of finished work. Esther sat on the fence at the edge of the field with a cup of coffee and looked at what they had done, and Phineas sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and Marcus Webb and his men were loading the last of the equipment and talking in the easy way of men who are tired in the good way, and for a few minutes everything was simple. "Thank you," she said. "I tied sheaves," he said. "You grew the wheat." "I mean for all of it." She looked at her field. "I mean for telling me the truth when you could have sent me away confused. I mean for filing the legal opinion. I mean for coming out here when you did not have to. I mean for today." She paused. "I am not very good at accepting help. I have been on my own for a long time in different ways, and I learned to handle things myself. I am trying to remember that accepting help is not the same as being unable to handle things. I know, he said. I have the same problem. She looked at him sideways. Yes, I thought you might. Marcus Webb waved from across the field and called something about seeing Esther on Sunday at church, and she waved back, and then it was quiet again in the way that a field is quiet after everyone has left it, which is not actually quiet at all but full of wind and movement, and the particular hum of a place that has been worked. Phineas, she said. Yes. I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as something I am saying because I believe it to be true and not because I am frightened or grateful or in need of something. She turned to look at him fully. I think you are the most genuinely good man I have encountered in a very long time. I think you are also lonelier than you know, or perhaps you know it and have simply accepted it as the permanent condition of your life. I think, she said more quietly, that you do not have to accept that. He was very still. I am a widow with a disputed piece of land and 10 days of wheat proceeds in a tin box under my kitchen floor, she continued. I am not what anyone would describe as an advantageous prospect, but I find that I have stopped caring very much about advantageous and started caring a great deal about true, and the truest thing I know right now is that I want to see where this goes. She paused. If you do. He reached across the fence rail and covered her hand with his. I want to see where it goes, he said. She turned her hand over and held his. The court hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of October, and in the 2 weeks between the harvest and the hearing, Phineas and Esther developed the kind of rhythm that happens between two people when they have both decided to stop being careful about wanting something. He rode out to the property 3 times, and she came to Wellington twice, and they had dinner on one of those evenings at the hotel dining room, which generated exactly the volume of town gossip one would expect in a county seat of Wellington size, which they both knew and neither of them much minded. They talked the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other, which is to say they talked about everything that was not about the legal situation, and also about the legal situation, and also about the future in the tentative way that people approach a future that has not yet been secured. She told him about Ohio, and about the cholera summer that had taken everyone, and about the specific way grief had made her practical rather than soft, because there was no one to be soft around and being practical was the only form of survival available. He told her about his father and the surveying trips, about standing in fields at dawn with measuring equipment, and learning that the world could be described precisely, and that the description was a form of understanding. He told her about Clara, carefully, not because it still hurt in a sharp way, but because it was a true thing about him, and she deserved to know the true things. She listened to the Clara story without interruption, and when he was done she said simply, "She was right that something was missing, but I think what was missing was not in you. I think it was in the situation." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I think you are the kind of person who comes fully alive in proportion to how fully they are seen. And I think there are people in the world who do not look closely enough to see what is there, not because they are bad but because they have not learned to look that way." She met his eyes. "I look that way. I always have. It has not always been an asset." He said nothing for a moment because what she had said was so precisely true that it knocked the air out of him slightly. Then he said, "I think you are also the kind of person who comes fully alive in proportion to how fully they are trusted." She was quiet. "Yes," she said finally, "that is also very true." The evening at the hotel dining room ended with them standing outside in the cold, and him holding her hands and neither of them willing to say good night, which was something he found both absurd and completely right. He walked her back to Mrs. Hensley's, where she had taken a room for the week of the hearing, and at the door he kissed her, which was not planned but was also the most natural thing that had happened to him in 3 years, and she kissed him back with the directness that was her characteristic way of doing everything, and when they separated they were both slightly breathless and smiling in a way that the cold air turned to vapor in the dark. "Good night, Phineas," she said. "Good night, Esther," he said, and he could not stop smiling on the walk back to his rooms, which were above a hardware store 3 streets away, and he lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling with the particular wakefulness of a man who is happy and finds it slightly alarming. The district court hearing was on a Thursday morning, and the courthouse was full, because in Sumner County in 1879, a land dispute involving Harlan Cutter and a widow with a legitimate claim was the kind of drama that the population attended in the same spirit they might attend a theatrical performance, which is to say with a great deal of interest and some partisan feeling. Judge Cornelius Hatch was 40 years old and had been appointed to the district seat from Topeka, which meant his political connections ran north rather than south, which meant Harlan Cutter's usual leverage had very little purchase on him. Phineas had researched the man thoroughly and had concluded that he was, at minimum, someone who took the legal record seriously, which was all he needed. Tobias Vane presented Cutter's case with considerable elaboration. He argued that the deed in Thomas Brooks's name had been transferred to Harlan Cutter in satisfaction of a documented debt of $300, that the transfer was executed in good faith, that the subsequent filing of the deed in Esther Brooks's name had been made without disclosure of the encumbrance, and that therefore the Cutter deed should take priority. The county attorney, George Alderman, presented Esther's case with less elaboration but more precision. He presented the filing record showing the Brooks deed was registered on April 14th. He presented the statute requiring that deed transfers for Sumner County properties be filed with the Sumner County Land Office to be valid. He noted that the Cutter deed had never been filed. Then Phineas testified. He had been in courtrooms before as a witness, but this was different in the specific way that things are different when more than the abstract principle is at stake. He sat in the witness chair, and he answered every question with the same precision he brought to every task, and he was aware of Esther sitting in the gallery behind the bar with her hands in her lap and her back very straight, and Marcus Webb on one side of her and Mrs. Hensley, who had appointed herself a partisan without anyone asking her, on the other. Tobias Vane cross-examined him for 40 minutes, trying to find a seam in the record, suggesting that a properly executed deed should take priority over a filing date, suggesting that the filing requirement was technical rather than substantive, suggesting various things that Phineas dispatched with the methodical patience of a man who knows the law better than his questioner and is not in a hurry. At the end of the 40 minutes, Vane sat down. Judge Hatch looked at his notes. "The law in Kansas on this matter is not ambiguous," he said. "A deed transfer of real property is not valid until it is filed with the county land office of the county in which the property is situated. This requirement exists precisely to prevent the kind of competing claims that arise in this case. The deed in the name of Esther Brooks was properly filed. The deed allegedly in the name of Harlan Cutter was not. Whatever private agreements may have existed between Thomas Brooks and Harlan Cutter, the legal title to this property belongs to Esther Brooks. Any claim Harlan Cutter has arising from the alleged debt of Thomas Brooks's estate is a matter for probate, not land law." He closed the folder, ruling for the plaintiff, "This court is adjourned." Harlan Cutter left the courthouse without looking at anyone. Tobias Vane gathered his papers. George Alderman permitted himself a small, satisfied expression. Esther was very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then Marcus Webb said something to her, and she nodded, and she stood, and she turned toward the gallery exit, and she saw Phineas coming from the witness area, and her face did something that he thought he would spend a considerable amount of time remembering in the years ahead, which was simply to open, all the careful management of these weeks releasing at once, and she crossed the distance between them and took both his hands. "Thank you," she said, and this time it meant everything. "You won this," he said. "The law won it. You made the law work," she said. There is a difference. They stood there in the emptying courtroom holding hands while the bailiff moved chairs, and the morning light came through the high windows, and Phineas thought about how 3 weeks ago he had been bent over a ledger in his organized office and had looked up and been surprised, and how the surprise had turned out to be the most important thing that had happened to him in years. The winter came in hard that year, the way Kansas winters do, with a decisiveness that makes you understand why the people who stay are a particular kind of stubborn. The dispute was resolved, and Harlan Cutter had departed the scene of his defeat with the tight silence of a man who is planning a more patient form of revenge. But Phineas had consulted with aldermen, and they had quietly ensured that the county records were in such impeccable order that there was nothing Cutter could challenge without making himself look absurd. The wheat money came in, and Esther paid off the remaining debts on the property and hired Marcus Webb's youngest son to help with the winter work. She stayed in Caldwell on her land, which was where she belonged. Phineas was in Wellington, which was 18 miles, which in the autumn of 1879 on Kansas prairie roads meant approximately 2.5 hours on horseback in good conditions and considerably longer when the weather had opinions. He rode it every week, sometimes twice. She started keeping coffee hot at certain times of day that corresponded to his likely arrival, which was a form of wordless trust that he found more moving than he was prepared for. They talked about everything. About the farm and the office and the town and the weather and books and the past, and carefully at first and then less carefully, about the future. He told her about the ways the land office work had kept him from thinking about his own life, and she told him about the ways the farm work had done the same, and they discovered that they had both been doing versions of the same thing, which was staying so busy with the present tense that the future could not require anything of them. On a Sunday afternoon in late November, 2 days after the first real snow of the season, he rode out to the property and found her splitting firewood in the yard. She was not struggling with it. She was perfectly competent with an axe, but he took it from her anyway and split wood for an hour while she stacked, and when they were done and had come inside and were sitting by the stove with the kind of warmth that is partly physical and partly something else entirely, he told her he loved her. He said it plainly, because he had learned from her that plain was better than decorated, and that the direct version of a true thing was the only version worth saying. She set her coffee cup down and looked at him with those October eyes that had never once in all these weeks stopped being the eyes he thought about when she was not present. Then she said, "I love you too. I have been loving you for weeks and trying to decide whether it was reasonable given the circumstances, and concluding that love is not particularly interested in being reasonable, and I have given up trying to argue it into something more sensible." He laughed. She laughed too. Then he kissed her and she kissed him, and the fire in the stove made its small domestic sounds, and outside the snow was doing what snow does in Kansas, which is whatever it likes. He asked her to marry him on a Friday in December, sitting at her kitchen table with snow on the window glass and the smell of bread in the air, without a great deal of preamble because preamble was not their way. He told her that he knew it was soon by the standards that people generally apply to these things, and that he also knew that the standards people generally applied to these things were not always accurate guides to the specific shape of specific situations, and that this specific situation felt to him as clear and as correctly described as any record he had ever maintained. She said yes before he finished the sentence, which he would later tell her was because she had been waiting for him to ask since approximately the courthouse hearing, and which she would dispute and he would maintain, and they would never quite resolve, which turned out to be fine. They were married in January of 1880 in the small church in Wellington, with George Alderman as witness and Marcus Webb and his family in attendance, and Mrs. Hensley in the front row with a handkerchief she used considerably. It was cold and the road from Caldwell had been difficult, and there was no honeymoon in the conventional sense, because January on the Kansas prairie does not accommodate elaborate travel plans. What there was instead was the house on the property, which Phineas had been working with Marcus Webb's son to expand since December, adding a proper parlor and a room that could become other things as the future required, and the 18-mile road between Wellington and Caldwell, which they had traveled so many times in these months that it felt like a thread between their two lives waiting to be wound into one. He arranged with the county commissioners to work 3 days a week in Wellington and to handle the remaining administrative correspondence from Caldwell, which the commissioners approved because Phineas's work was so thorough and the records so well maintained that 3 days a week of him was worth 5 days a week of a less organized person. He built a small office space in the house, a room with a desk and filing cabinets and the same precise order that had characterized the Wellington office, and he worked from there in the mornings while Esther was in the fields or with the animals. They fell into the kind of daily life that looks ordinary from the outside and is nothing of the kind from the inside, which is the particular secret of people who have found the right person after a long time of not finding them. The mornings were work, and the afternoons were often together, walking the property or riding into town or simply reading in the same room, and the evenings were meals and talk, and the ongoing revelation of two people who are genuinely interested in each other, and find that the interest does not diminish. Esther planted winter wheat in February, pushing it as early as the ground would allow, because she had a plan for the spring crop that was larger than the previous year and required the extended growing window. She talked about soil composition and drainage and seed selection with the same thoroughness that Phineas brought to legal interpretation, and he listened and asked questions that were genuinely curious, not performed, and she loved him for the questions as much as for anything else. He loved her for too many things to list, though if required he could have produced a list with the same methodical completeness he brought to everything. The directness, the practicality that was not hardness, the way she made coffee automatically at the time he was likely to need it, which was a form of attention that he had never received from anyone, the way she argued with him when she disagreed fully and without apology, and was right approximately as often as he was, which was a statistic he found both humbling and entirely satisfying. The October eyes, the full smile that changed the room. The fact that she had walked into his organized office with 2 deeds and 1 question, and had somehow, in the process of asking it, answered something in him that he had not known was a question. In the early spring of 1880, a letter arrived from Wichita bearing the seal of a law firm. Phineas read it at his desk and then walked into the kitchen where Esther was at the table with seed catalogs. "Harlan Cutter is selling the ranches," he said. She looked up. "Both of them." "Both, and the feed store. The letter is from a firm handling the sales. They are also noting that Cutter is releasing all claims against the estate of Thomas Brooks, including the alleged debt, in consideration of the settlement of other legal matters I suspect are related to an investigation of the notarization practices used in the deed transfer." Esther was quiet for a moment. The notarization in Wichita. Someone looked at it more carefully than I was able to from Wellington. The notary who stamped it may have had some irregularities in their practice. He sat down across from her. "Cutter is leaving Sumner County." She absorbed this. "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved. You?" "The same. Also," she paused, and he could see her working through something. "Also aware that the problem was never really Harlan Cutter specifically. He was a man who believed that what he wanted superseded what the law said, and that money and influence could bridge the difference. He is leaving, but the attitude does not leave with him. There will be other men like that." "Yes," Phineas said. "There will always be other men like that, which is why the records matter, why the law matters." He reached across and covered her hand, a gesture that had become their particular shorthand for a large variety of things. "You were right to come to the land office." She turned her hand over. "I was right about which man to ask." The spring wheat went in on schedule, the largest planting Esther had managed since she first came to the property. Marcus Webb's son worked with her 3 days a week now on a proper wage arrangement, and the farm had a different quality from the year before, a settled competence that was the result of the worry having been removed from the equation, which frees up enormous amounts of energy that can be directed at the actual work. Phineas made the ride to Wellington 3 times a week through spring and then through summer. He hired a junior clerk to handle the daily business at the office, a young man named Clement Pierce, who was 18 and earnest and reminded Phineas of himself at that age, which made him a patient teacher. He organized the filing system to be even more accessible than before so that Clement could find anything needed on the days Phineas was not there. The land office work continued, and the spring brought a wave of new filings as settlers moved into the open land north of Wellington, and Phineas processed each one with the same precision he had always brought to the work. But there was something different in his relationship to the job now. He had always cared about the accuracy of the records for the principle of it, for the abstract justice of correct documentation. Now he cared about it differently, in a way that was concrete and personal, because he had seen with complete clarity what an incorrect or incomplete record could cost a person, and the person it had nearly cost was someone he loved. He told Esther this one evening in late June when they were sitting on the front step watching the evening come in over the wheat, which was growing toward its summer height and making that sound that he now thought of as her sound, the collective whisper of things she had tended becoming alive. "You changed how I think about the work," he said. "I gave you one case," she said. "You gave me the reason why the cases matter. I always knew the law mattered abstractly. I did not always remember that the abstract is made of actual people." She was quiet for a moment, her shoulder against his, the evening warm and the wheat moving. "I think you would have come to that eventually," she said. "You are not a man who is comfortable with abstractions for very long." "No," he agreed. "I am not." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did when she was tired in the comfortable way rather than the difficult way, and he put his arm around her. And they sat there while the stars came out over the prairie and the wheat whispered, and the evening turned into night in the gradual way that summer evenings do, as though not wanting to commit to darkness entirely. The summer harvest was remarkable. Better than the previous year, better than anything the property had produced since Thomas Brooks first planted it, and Esther stood at the edge of the finished field on the last day of harvest, with the same expression she had worn when the court ruling came down, which was the expression of a person who has been fighting for something long enough that winning still feels slightly unreal. Phineas stood beside her. He had been there for the whole harvest this time, taking the week away from the office with Clement managing the routine matters and the promise that nothing requiring the registrar's personal attention had come in. He had gotten considerably better with the sheaves. Marcus Webb had told him, with the laconic approval of a Kansas farmer, that he would make a decent harvest hand if the land office ever fell through. They sold the grain in August, and Esther paid off the last of the property taxes and made 2 improvements to the house that she had been planning for a year. There was a new cook stove, which was a source of considerable domestic satisfaction, and a proper smokehouse, which Phineas helped build on 3 consecutive Sundays with Marcus Webb, and a level of competence that surprised him and delighted Esther. In September, she told him quietly at the breakfast table that she was expecting a child. She said it with the particular mixture of joy and terror that belongs to someone who wants a thing very much and therefore cannot entirely believe it is happening. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something move through him that had no ready name, something large and warm and slightly frightening in the way that all the best things are frightening because they mean you have something to lose. He took her hands across the table. He said her name. She looked at him with bright eyes that were doing something complicated, and he said, "I am glad," which was inadequate but also the truest thing available, and she said, "So am I." And they sat there for a while just being glad together. The baby was born in May of 1881, a boy, delivered by the doctor from Wellington who arrived only slightly later than he should have due to spring mud on the road, and who was, fortunately, a competent man who had handled much worse. Esther was extraordinary through it, which Phineas would have expected if he had been capable of expecting anything during those hours, which he was not, because this was the one situation where his natural precision completely failed him, and he had to simply be present without being able to organize anything. They named him James, after Phineas's father, which was Esther's suggestion, and which made him quiet for a long moment when she said it. And then he said yes simply, because it was the right name for the right reasons, and anything he could say about it would be less than what he felt. James Thomas Shepard was born on a Tuesday with the particular vehemence of someone who has opinions about a rival, and he was red-faced and loud, and exactly what both of them wanted, which was something living and theirs in the house that had become their life. The land office work continued. Clement Pierce grew into a capable junior registrar, and Phineas spent less time in Wellington and more on the property, which the county commissioners accepted because the quality of the records remained impeccable. He surveyed the property properly in the fall of 1881, walking every boundary himself with the equipment his father had left him, mapping it with the same precision his father had taught him, and filing the completed survey with his office as a formal addition to the record. The survey turned up something interesting. The 40 acres that Esther had been farming was, according to the proper measurements, 43 acres. The original description had rounded down. 3 acres of good land on the creek side that belonged to the property and had simply been uncounted. He told her this at dinner, and she stared at him for a moment and then laughed, the full laugh that still changed the room. Thomas always did round down, she said. He thought it was a form of modesty. It is also a form of inaccuracy, Phineas said, which is approximately what I would expect from a man who signed 2 deeds to the same property. She laughed again, and he laughed too, and James, who was 6 months old and had opinions about family dinners involving conversation he could not participate in, made a sound that stopped them both and made them look at him, and then at each other. And the look that passed between them was one of those looks that have no precise translation but mean everything. The 3 acres on the creek side turned out to be particularly good for kitchen garden work, and Esther planted them the following spring with vegetables rather than wheat, a diversification that proved so successful that the next year she expanded it and began selling produce in the Wellington market on the days Phineas was in town. She would ride in with him and set up her market space, and he would go to the office, and they would meet at noon at the hotel dining room, which was the same dining room where they had had dinner while she was still technically Mrs. Brooks of Caldwell, and he was technically just the land registrar who had answered her one question. The hotel had changed very little. The dining room was the same. Mrs. Hensley, who had largely adopted them both as something between protégés and entertainment, always waved if she passed on the street. Harlan Cutter had left Sumner County entirely by the end of 1880. There were various accounts of where he had gone and what had become of him, none of them verifiable, and most of them satisfying to the people who had spent years watching him accumulate influence at the expense of people with less power. Tobias Vane had followed him, which was a relief to the County Bar Association, which had never quite known what to do with him. The property that had been Cutter's 2 ranches was purchased by a consortium of smaller operators and broken up into working family farms, which Phineas processed through the land office with a particular satisfaction. Each filing was precise and complete and cross-referenced, and he filed them himself rather than delegating to Clement, because some records you want to put in place with your own hands. James Shepard at 18 months was an entity with strong views about the world and the energy to express them continuously, which Esther managed with the same practical competence she brought to everything, and which Phineas managed with a combination of delight and mild bewilderment that she found endearing. He was very good at reading to James, sitting in the chair by the stove with the baby in his lap and a book open. The same precision and patience he brought to records applied to this small person who showed no interest in precision, but an extraordinary appetite for the stories. Esther watched them from across the room sometimes, her husband and her son, and felt something that she had no adequate word for except perhaps rightness, which is not a dramatic emotion, but is possibly the most profound one, the sense of being exactly where the shape of your life was always pointing. She had come to the land office with 2 deeds and 1 question, and had received the legal answer, and also, without knowing she was looking for it, the beginning of everything else. She thought about this sometimes, about how the crisis that had felt like destruction had turned out to be the mechanism of arrival, which is the thing about hard moments that is almost never visible until after. Phineas thought about it too, though in his characteristically more organized way, which meant he had identified the specific moment when the surprise of her had begun to convert into something more durable. And the moment was not the first time he saw her eyes, though that was when it started, and not the walk to Mrs. Hensley's, and not the evening at her kitchen table in the lamplight. The moment was when she had said, "You are a man who is very good at being useful and very cautious about being known," because in one sentence she had described him more accurately than anyone had in years, and the accuracy had felt like the opposite of danger, which is not a word but is a feeling, the feeling of being seen and finding it safe. He had been cautious about being known because knowing involves risk, and risk had been managed for 3 years by the precise management of everything else. She had made knowing feel like something other than risk. She had made it feel like land properly surveyed and recorded, like a document filed in the right office at the right time in the right name, like a thing that would hold. In the spring of 1882, Esther told him there would be a second child, with considerably more certainty and less terror than the first announcement, the confidence of a woman who has already done this once and knows the shape of what is coming. This time Phineas received the news at the breakfast table with more composure, which is to say, he only sat in silence for 30 seconds before speaking instead of the full minute of the previous time, and Esther told him this was significant improvement. The second child was also a boy, born in November of 1882, which was either a sign or a coincidence depending on one's inclinations, and they named him Robert, after no one in particular except that it seemed like a name that would fit a person who had not yet had time to develop characteristics. Robert proved, in the way of second children, to be exactly opposite to James in temperament, which was calm where James was loud and watchful where James was energetic, and the 2 of them together in the house produced a domestic ecosystem of remarkable complexity. Esther managed it with a grace that Phineas observed with consistent admiration. She was the same person she had been in the land office with the 2 deeds, the same directness and practicality and capacity for strategic thinking, all of it applied now to the farm and the household and the children and the market, and the ongoing work of a life that was more than it had been and expanding in the right directions. He was different from who he had been in ways that he found mostly good. Less sealed, less convinced that order was a substitute for everything else. Still precise, still thorough, still the kind of person who organized filing cabinets to a degree that impressed and slightly alarmed other people. But the precision was in the service of something larger now, which is that the record of the land office was the record of people's lives and futures, and he handled it accordingly. He expanded the office itself in 1883, with the commissioner's approval, adding a second clerk and a system of indexed cross-references that would allow any member of the public to search the records themselves, rather than being dependent entirely on the registrar. It was a reform he had been thinking about for 2 years, and that he described in the proposal to the commissioners in purely practical terms, about efficiency and public access. The reason underneath the practical reason was that he had watched Esther come in with 2 deeds and be told by essentially everyone, except him, to go away and figure it out herself. And the thought that another person in the same situation might find themselves without access to information about their own land was something he found intolerable. Clement Pierce, his junior clerk, used the new system to help 14 people in the first year resolve questions about their property records that they had previously been unable to navigate. Phineas counted those 14 as among the better outcomes of the year, alongside the winter wheat, which had been excellent, and Robert's first word, which had been mysteriously fence, a predilection that suggested a future interest in agriculture. James, at 3, was firmly convinced that books were the best objects in the world and could be found at any point of the day attempting to look at them, whether or not he could read them yet, which he was beginning to manage with Phineas's patient instruction. The reading lessons happened in the evening by the lamp, father and son at the table while Esther worked nearby, and sometimes she would stop what she was doing and listen to Phineas's voice moving through the words with the quiet patience that was his characteristic mode, and she would feel the same thing she always felt watching him be present with their children, which was that the loneliness she had once identified in him had been completely displaced by something else. She had been right. That afternoon on the fence at the edge of the wheat field in the autumn of their first year, that he was the kind of person who came fully alive in proportion to how fully he was seen. She had not understood at the time the complete truth of it, which was not just that he needed to be seen, but that he needed to have somewhere to direct the fullness of his attention, and that when he had it, the attention was the most generous and sustaining thing she had ever been on the receiving end of. He brought that attention to everything. To the records and to the children and to the farm and to her, consistently and completely, in the way of someone who has learned that presence is not a resource that depletes but one that compounds. She told him this one evening in the kitchen when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet after children who have been loudly awake all day finally release the day. She told him that she had come to the land office with one question, and had not known she was also carrying the questions she could not articulate, the ones about whether there was a way forward that was not just practical management of impossible circumstances, whether the future was just survival or something more than that. He listened to all of it without interrupting. And, he said, when she finished, "And the answer to those questions is also yes," she said. "The ones I could not ask, the answer to those is also yes." He was quiet for a moment, the lamp between them on the table, the house around them holding the ordinary evidence of their life, the children's things, the books, the coffee cups, the papers from the farm accounts on the end of the table, the whole accumulated material reality of years lived in one place together. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. Before you walked into the office, I was very good at my job and almost nothing else. I had made a kind of peace with that, or I thought I had. When you asked your question and I had the answer, the thing I thought was not that I had helped someone. The thing I thought was that I wanted to know what your next question was." She looked at him. "I have never stopped wanting to know what your next question is," he said. "Every day. That is what this is for me. Not just love, though it is love. It is also that you are the most interesting ongoing question of my life, and I intend to spend a very long time finding out the answer." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Phineas," she said. "Yes. That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard. That also sounds exactly like a land registrar." He laughed, surprised again, and she laughed with him. And outside the Kansas night was doing what it always did, which was to be enormous and full of stars, and entirely indifferent to the small, warm particulars of human happiness, but also somehow not indifferent at all, in the way that a large and permanent landscape is the context that makes the small and particular things visible, the frame around everything that matters. The years that followed were full in the way that lives are full when they are going the direction they are meant to go. James learned to read properly and then extensively and then began, at 7, to have opinions about books that he shared at length during meals. Robert turned out to have a gift for animals that became apparent when he spent 3 consecutive days at the age of 4 negotiating a truce with a particularly difficult goat, and Esther took note of this with the practicality of a farmer who knows a useful skill when she sees one. The farm expanded gradually. The creek land was folded into a full vegetable and fruit growing operation that Esther ran with the same systematic approach she had always brought to the wheat, and by 1885 the Brooks Shepard property, as it was known in the county records, was producing 4 distinct types of crops and a small dairy operation that Marcus Webb's son had helped establish. The market presence in Wellington grew from a seasonal table to a regular weekly space, and Esther developed a reputation in the county for the quality of her produce and for being someone you did not attempt to underprice. Phineas's reputation in the land office had by this time extended considerably beyond Sumner County. He had been asked twice to consult on complex cases in neighboring counties, and in 1884 the state land commissioner had written to him, requesting his thoughts on proposed reforms to the filing requirements that would make the kind of improper transfer Harlan Cutter had attempted impossible in any Kansas county. He had written back at length, citing 7 specific legal precedents and 3 suggested statutory changes, and 2 of the 3 had been incorporated into the reform as written. He told Esther about this on the evening after he sent the response, not to be proud, but because she was the person he told things to, the person who received all the information of his life and gave it back to him organized in a slightly different way, which was what good conversation between 2 people who know each other well always does. She read the reform letter herself and told him that the second statutory change was the most important one. He asked why. She explained in terms of what it would have meant for someone in her situation in 1879. He listened, and then revised his covering letter to include an additional paragraph making exactly that point, which he sent separately. The Land Commissioner's office wrote back acknowledging the additional paragraph as a particularly compelling argument. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her once. "I am a farmer," she said, "which requires a great deal of law and very little of the parts you are legally allowed to charge for." In 1886, they had a 3rd child, a girl this time, who arrived in August with the particular determination of someone who had waited long enough and had decided now was the time. They named her Clara, which was Esther's choice, and when she said the name he understood that she had chosen it deliberately, with the same directness she brought to everything, saying without saying it that the past was not something to be hidden but something to be acknowledged and then placed in its proper context, which for the name Clara was as the name of a woman who had made a reasonable choice that had led, eventually and through a long road, to the right outcome. He was moved by this in a way he did not have precise words for, which was increasingly the condition he found himself in, the precise man undone by the imprecision of everything that mattered most. Clara was her brother's devoted and somewhat tyrannical younger sibling from approximately her 2nd birthday onward, and the household that had been complex became genuinely spectacular. Esther managed it all with the efficiency of someone who had been farming alone, and had therefore never developed the habit of expecting anything to be easy. Phineas helped with the same patient precision he brought to the ledgers, except that ledgers did not have opinions about bedtime and Clara had extremely robust ones. The land office, the farm, the Wellington market, the 3 children, the 18 miles of Kansas road between the property and the county seat, the evenings by the lamp, the morning coffee that was always ready at the right time, the ongoing conversation between 2 people who have never stopped being interested in each other. This was the texture of their life, which was ordinary in the way that all the best lives are ordinary, which is to say it was completely specific and entirely unrepeatable, and the particular shape of everything they were. Marcus Webb retired from active farming in 1887, and his son took over the operation next door, and the families had by then been neighbors and practical extended family for so long that the transition was seamless. The Webbs were at Sunday dinner regularly, and the Shepard children had effectively grown up alongside the Webb grandchildren, which meant the property in those years was often full of children of various ages with various opinions about everything, and the noise was considerable, and Phineas, who had once worked in silence in a very organized office, found that he did not miss the silence at all. He did on occasion retreat to his office in the house, the room with the filing cabinets and the desk, and work in the quiet that was available there. But the retreat was different now from the retreat of the Wellington years. Then, the office had been where he lived. Now it was where he worked, and the difference between those two things was all the difference in the world. He still rode to Wellington 3 times a week, which was now on a proper road that had been graded and marked since the early days of the settlement expansion, and the ride that had taken 2.5 hours in 1879 on a difficult autumn road took 90 minutes on the improved surface. He still processed every deed and filing and transfer with the same methodical precision. He still, as he had from the beginning, handled each document as though it represented a person's future, because it did, and the knowledge that it did was now not abstract but specific, rooted in the memory of a woman placing 2 documents on his counter with a steadiness that had cost her everything she had, and asking the one question he could answer. On a Thursday morning in October of 1888, 9 years after Esther Brooks had walked into the Sumner County Land Office, Phineas sat at his desk in the Wellington office and processed a filing from a young woman named Martha Hoyt who had just married, and was transferring her late father's property into her married name. The filing was straightforward and complete, properly notarized, all the information correctly provided, and he processed it in the efficient way of the experienced registrar he was. But he took a moment, as he always did now, to look at the name on the document and to think about the fact that the 40 acres described in the filing was someone's future, and that the correctness of this record was the guarantee of that future, and that the guarantee mattered. He filed it carefully, in exactly the right place, cross-referenced with the 3 related documents it connected to. Then he rode home. Esther was at the kitchen table with Clara, who was 2, and was engaged in a complex dispute with a spoon that she was clearly winning. James, 11, was in the parlor with a book. Robert, 6, was outside with the goat who had been succeeded by several subsequent goats, all of whom appeared to find in Robert a kindred spirit. Esther looked up when he came in, and her face did what it always did, the specific opening that she had never managed to make less visible, which he suspected she had stopped trying to hide sometime in the 2nd or 3rd year of their marriage, and which he considered among the great ongoing gifts of his life. "The Hollies filing?" she asked. She had been following the complex multi-property case he had been working through for 3 weeks with the interest she brought to everything he told her. "Resolved," he said. The second deed was a duplicate exactly as the record suggested. "Good." She looked satisfied. "Sit down. There is coffee." He sat down across from her, and Clara transferred her attention from the spoon to him with the immediacy of someone who has detected a more interesting source of engagement. He picked her up, and she settled against him with the comfortable weight of a child who is used to being held, and he looked at Esther over Clara's head. "Good day," he said. "Very good," she agreed. "The winter wheat is looking well. I think this year's yield will exceed last year's." "It usually does." "Optimism," she said, "backed by evidence. Your favorite kind." "My only kind," he said. She smiled at him, the full smile that had not changed, and the kitchen was warm, and the child in his arms was warm, and outside Robert was having a conversation with the goat in the serious tone he always used with animals, and James was turning pages in the parlor, and the coffee was exactly the right temperature, and the evening was coming in over the Kansas prairie with the slow gold light of October. And Phineas Shepard thought, with the particular clarity of a man who knows how to describe things precisely, that this was the truest document of his life, the one that would hold. He had been a man in a very organized office looking for order in the records of other people's lives. She had come in with 2 deeds and 1 question. He had given her the legal answer, the accurate, properly researched, lawfully grounded answer that the records supported, and in the giving of it he had also found the answer to something he had not known was a question. They had built a life on that ground. Properly filed, correctly recorded, cross-referenced with everything that mattered, witnessed by the people who loved them, and maintained with the kind of daily attention that is not the dramatic gesture but the real thing, the permanent thing, the thing that holds when the wind comes across the prairie, and the winter arrives without warning and the circumstances change in ways that no one planned. James called from the parlor about dinner. Robert came in from outside with mud on his boots and a report on the goat. Clara, deciding that sitting still was not her best use of time, squirmed to be set down and was set down and went immediately to where her mother was, and Esther gathered her up and looked at Phineas across the ordinary beautiful chaos of their kitchen. "Dinner," she said. "Dinner," he agreed. He got up and helped, as he always did, in the easy division of labor that had developed between them over years, and the children were loud and the food was good, and the evening was warm, and outside the stars were beginning to appear over the Kansas prairie, the way they always did, extravagant and permanent, the same stars that had been there on the night he had walked back to his rooms after leaving her at Mrs. Hensley's door, and had not been able to stop smiling. The same stars that had watched 2 people find each other in a small land office over 2 disputed deeds and 1 clear question, and had begun, from that first precise moment, to build something that would last.